to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. In this episode, we'll discuss the second Sunday of Advent, which also falls on St. Nicholas Day this year. Also, a big thank you to Rachel Meyer-Laughlin for our theme song. It's new with our new podcast, so we're excited about it.
Since we're not using a blog anymore, we invite you to check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode. As Emily said, our set of readings today is from the second Sunday of Advent, which this year falls on the 6th of December. And for our deep dive today, we ask, who is St. Nicholas? St. Nicholas of Myra was the bishop of a city called Myra in what is now Turkey in the 4th century. And he was known at the time for being kind to children, for paying the dowries of girls from poor families so they could get married, which was the good option at the time. And there are also lots of other legends about him, including one story that he was briefly imprisoned for slapping the heretic Arius during a church council meeting, which is apparently one of the more memorable ones, although there are several. He's often portrayed when he's drawn or painted as wearing a lot of red, and as an older man with a beard that is either gray or white, and he's usually making a sign of blessing toward the person who's looking at his portrait. St. Nicholas Day has often been celebrated by children putting their shoes just outside their bedroom doors, so that St. Nick could come along and fill them with candy, oranges, and sometimes a little money. Also, Emily and I have a favorite St. Nicholas meme that we will be sharing on our Facebook page.
So check us out on December 6th.
Absolutely.
Also, St. Nicholas Day is celebrated a little bit differently in all sorts of different cultures. In some countries that celebrate name days, like Slovakia, which is where I lived for a year after I graduated from college, December 6th is the name day for Nicholas, or Mikuláš. In Slovak, we would call it Svätý Mikuláš. And it had similar things of some little toys and that sort of a thing for kids. And St. Nicholas would come with, like, a little angel and a little devil to, like, give the exciting, like, candy and stuff, or some warnings, like onions or something, just to, like, set by the shoes to warn the kids that next year that might be all they get.
Is this one of those things where becoming a grown-up changes your perspective? Because, like, if someone wanted to give me onions now, I would be totally excited about that. I love onions.
I'd be more excited about garlic, but yeah.
Well, that too, yeah. I don't mind garlic. Sure.
I think there is perspective, like candy versus onions.
I mean, if they wanted to drop the candy off too, I wouldn't object to that either. I'm just saying.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I really love about these ways of thinking about St. Nicholas and the work that St. Nicholas does, I know in the United States in particular, Santa Claus has become very commercialized, but even Santa Claus has the origins of St. Nicholas, and coal, which is the bad stuff, was actually like, it wasn't as exciting or as fun, but it was still something that was needed for people living in poverty. They needed the coal to make it through the winter. And so while kids might not be excited about that, it's still helpful. And I love that the onions too, right? While kids might not be excited about it, it's still something that helps the family. And so I love that aspect of St. Nicholas, that there's little things that can help. Yay! Happy St. Nicholas Day.
Indeed.
Our first reading for today is from Isaiah chapter 40, verses 1 through 11. In a passage often chosen for funerals and great tragedies, God acknowledges human suffering and mortality, and offers comfort, grace, and deliverance. Meanwhile, we are called to prepare the way of the Lord. One of the themes for this passage is accessibility. That God's glory is accessible to all people. So we hear in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway, lifting up valleys and lowering mountains, making it so that there's an even playing field for everyone, which is this beautiful imagery. And I think about them many, many times throughout science fiction, whether it's the Marvel Cinematic Universe or Doctor Who or some other sci-fi experience, where everybody gets to experience this bizarre, amazing thing, and then after it's over and it's all cleaned up, usually at the behest of the government, everybody starts to like forget it or like question if it really happened or not. And so it's this like, just because everybody experienced it does not mean that anybody will actually like remember it as a real thing that happened and not just in their imaginations.
And that happens in real life too, I think.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
In verse 1, we hear God say, "Comfort, O comfort my people." I once used this passage to create a litany for a group memorial service that the hospital that I worked at did every year for those who had died there the year before. And there are plenty of great funeral and memorial scenes in various nerdy universes, and also certainly a few terrible ones that we won't go into. But one of the ones that has always just stuck with me is from another one of those fantasy movies that isn't always acknowledged as fantasy, What Dreams May Come, starring Robin Williams and Annabella Sciorra. The funeral scene for the children, while only very briefly portrayed and you don't actually see any of the service itself, was such a strong visual in a movie that was filled with strong visuals done so well. It stayed with me, and also somewhat the other funeral scene as well. And in particular, the portrayal of Annie's grief in that movie is one of the best, most accurate and moving portrayals of grief that I've ever seen. They did a wonderful job with that.
Yeah, I haven't seen that movie in a really long time, but it's so beautiful.
I've also read the book, and there are some interesting differences in the book, but it's really well written. It was written by Richard Matheson, I think. And then in verse 4, we hear, "Every valley shall be lifted up, every mountain and hill made low." In what I imagine might also become an ongoing theme on our podcast, it's time for Terrible Theology by Nerds. Robert Heinlein, a classic sci-fi author, perhaps best known for his epic Stranger in a Strange Land, which is a good book, although it does have its own odd theological ideas, once wrote a book called Job, A Comedy of Justice, which I'm not saying this is a great book, because it's not. It's interesting. It has a very specific intention, I guess you could say. But now I think about this book every time that I read this Bible verse, because it is a somewhat mocking portrayal of the Christian concept of the Last Judgment and what happens afterwards. And it specifically includes this verse literally happening, all the valleys lifted up, every mountain and hill made low, because of the bodily resurrection of the dead, as proclaimed in the book of Revelation and mentioned in the Apostles' Creed. Because there are suddenly so very many people after the resurrection wandering around on earth, the process of all of them walking around and the eventual destruction over time of building and such slowly leveled all the hills and valleys, and so the whole world's surface becomes smooth, is his theory. I don't remember whether or not the oceans disappeared. Heinlein was an enthusiastic atheist who had a lot of scorn for the Christian church, and for the most part I don't blame him or others like him, because frankly the church has done a lot of terrible things and earned plenty of that. But this book honestly reads more like an admission from the author that these are things I could have talked to a therapist about, but instead I decided to write this novel. So, on the other hand, I think if you're looking for a book and you're wondering, do I have the emotional maturity to go out and work with people who have been hurt by the church and listen to their stories and accept the criticisms that they have? If you're asking yourself, can I do that? Reading this book can probably answer that question for you.
Good to know. I was more drawn in by the second half of the passage and the temporality of, in verse 7, that we hear, the grass withers, the flower fades, when the breath of God blows upon it, surely the people are grass, right? This, like, everything just withers and fades. The image that came to mind was actually at the end of the Avengers Infinity War movie, when Thanos destroys half the population, and you just see, like, all of these people just, like, crumbling into dust and blowing away in the wind.
Yeah.
It was really powerful imagery in the movie. The ways that we fade and wither. And then in verse 9, we have this call to go up to a high mountain, to tell the good tidings, to tell all of the news in these, like, big and amazing ways. And so it reminded me of the announcement in the movie Interstellar, spoilers, when Murphy finally solves the problem and figures out how to save all of humanity. And she literally like has a stack of papers and she runs to the balcony in the science building facility and she shouts, "Eureka!" and like throws the papers and shouts it again and throws the papers again and kisses a guy. But like that's her like shouting this like brilliant news that was desperately needed in this time. Also, Interstellar is great. I love outer space.
Our second Bible passage for the second Sunday of Advent is from 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 through 15a. The author describes how God's perception of time is very different from ours, and that means that we have trouble predicting when God will act. Instead of trying to predict God's actions, we are encouraged to wait for God and strive for righteousness.
So one of the themes for this passage is waiting, which basically never happens in movies because, in fact, plot is the things that happen in the not waiting times. So unless there's like a time lapse, in which case there is waiting, and then we get like decades of waiting all condensed into like 30 seconds, which does happen in Jingle Jangle, the best new Christmas movie ever, but also happens in a variety of different movies where we see this time lapse. But the waiting that we're invited into and called into as Christians, particularly in this season of Advent, is also that like amorphous waiting where we don't have a timeline, and it might be decades, it might be centuries, it might be millennia, but it's this waiting and yet actively waiting and striving for righteousness in the midst of the waiting.
Right. In verse 8, we hear that with the Lord 1 day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like 1 day. Ooh, diverging time streams working at different speeds. There are actually a lot of interesting stories to reference on this one, but one of my favorite uses of this idea, that you might travel to a place where time flows differently, and therefore, while you think you're gone for a day, you've actually been gone much longer, or perhaps much shorter, is, of course, from the world of fanfiction, which should surprise exactly 0 of you if you've been listening to our previous podcast. There are quite a lot of stories that explain away the fact that in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Thor, after his first movie, and then again after the Avengers movie, is gone so long each time when he travels back to Asgard, much to Jane Foster's irritation. Obviously, the reason for it must be because time works differently in Asgard, and what is a few days there might be a few years on Earth.
That is like 0% where I thought you were going with that. I also was looking at this passage and thinking about it, but as you were talking, I was thinking about Interstellar and black holes and how time-space is warped around black holes, and so time moves.
Like that one Doctor Who episode with Billy and the Cybermen.
Yes. Also in Interstellar, which I just saw, because we were watching movies with snow and winter that weren't necessarily Christmas. Yes. So like black holes do that sort of time passage thing. So in addition to black holes, I also think about that Doctor Who functions, not just in that one example, but like largely Doctor Who functions of like, there is this bizarre concept of time because 1 day is like, who knows, right? This is how Amy and Rory give birth to a Time Lord because their wedding night lasts for like weeks. They like get married, get on the TARDIS, and are off, and like somehow they're sleeping, I'm sure, and eating and all of those things in that time. And they certainly are procreating. Like, how long is their wedding night?
The other thought that I immediately had when you got to that part was in the Odyssey, when Odysseus returns to Penelope, and the gods slow down time for them so that they can enjoy an evening together before Odysseus has to go out and, like, kill a bunch of guys.
Nice.
Verse 10. When we get to verse 10, we hear, "And the elements will be dissolved with fire." Meanwhile, all of the Avatar The Last Airbender fans are thinking to themselves, but fire is an element. General Iroh would be very confused by this.
So I was thinking about verse 10, and I once again went into like Elsa Anna Frozen land, but yes, fire is an element, and so how do the elements dissolve with fire? Blah, blah, blah. But also, it has like that it as a concept has some major Elsa Anna energy from the end of Frozen 2 when they finally figure out, spoilers, that they're the bridge between the elements and humanity, and so it's not so much a melting or dissolving with fire, but a joining together, which I feel like maybe the person who wrote 2 Peter wasn't a scientist and so didn't know how things worked like that, and maybe that's what they actually meant, because, Frozen 2 is totally based on science.
Of course. All Disney movies are.
Our gospel reading for the second Sunday of Advent is Mark chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. Mark introduces the good news of Jesus with John the Baptist, who arrives on the scene announcing the coming of Jesus and explaining how the two of them are different. So one of the themes for this is forerunners. John is a forerunner for Jesus, one who prepares the way and sets up Jesus for success, whatever that may actually look like, because Jesus was anti-imperialist and such. So, success. And it reminded me of the way that Tony Stark makes himself the forerunner for the new Spider-Man. And I think it definitely takes quite a while for Tony to realize that he is not actually the sun and everything does not actually revolve around him. But once Tony finally starts to get it, he recognizes that the new Spider-Man is, in fact, the one who's going to take what he has built and the progress that he's made and take it even farther. So John knows from the start that he is not the son. So he's better equipped to pass the baton, to carry the movement forward. I think it's interesting to me to think about this because I think Tony Stark in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is much more frequently portrayed as a savior, Jesus-y character, even with all of his character flaws. And yet, in this particular way, he's actually, explicitly not the savior character. He's setting, and it's in a Spider-Man movie, but he's setting up Spider-Man to be that character.
Yes, in verse 2, as we hear, as misquoted from the prophecy of Isaiah, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare the way. I, and I think most other Christians, presume that by prepare the way, God does not mean, like Stacker Pentecost meant in Pacific Rim when he suggested that he and Chuck Hansen clear a path for the lady by detonating a gigantic nuclear bomb to kill a couple of enormous homicidal monsters that were in his adopted daughter's way.
Whoa.
John the Baptist does not need nuclear bombs.
I've never seen that movie.
It is good fun.
I will take your word for that.
I'm not saying it's cinematic genius, but it's a lot of fun. They know they're an action movie and they just enjoy it.
Gotcha.
And Idris Elba is always wonderful. So.
Gotcha. Speaking of misquoting Isaiah, as we have just read, because we have Isaiah as our first reading for this day, it is not the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. It is the voice of one crying out, in the wilderness, prepare the way of our God. The Gospels do this, misquoting things and getting things both right and wrong at the same time thing a lot. Matthew's really great at it. Mark also clearly can do it.
Which, given that they were written in an age of low literacy and most people not having access to the actual text, not really a surprise.
We'll, give them a little bit of a pass on it.
Yeah.
But it is interesting the way things then, my Pentateuch and Wisdom Literature professor in seminary used to talk about that the prophecies that we read about in the Hebrew scriptures are not about Jesus, and yet as Christians, we experience Jesus as something different than that, but also that throughout the Hebrew scriptures, God fulfills God's promises in more abundant ways than the original promise or than we expect. And so this is this particular thing of, okay, they misquoted, but then look, John was in the wilderness crying out. Okay. And clearly that's why they misquoted, but it reminds me of my favorite tricky quoting and getting things right and wrong at the same time, which happens in Lord of the Rings when Ewing is confronting the ring wraith, and the ring wraith says, "No man can kill me," and Ewing pulls off her helmet and says, "I am no man," and stabs the ring wraith in what would be its face. I love that scene.
I don't know anyone who isn't a man who hasn't wished that they were Eowyn in that scene. Like, literally, I think the only blonde character I have ever actually wanted to be. I have nothing particularly against blondes, it's just the brunettes usually get the more fun parts. In verse 4, the many, many waves of people going out to see John the Baptist. I don't know why, but this time when I read that verse, it instantly reminded me of Star Trek The Final Frontier. Perhaps not one of the best Star Trek movies, but still memorable. Where Spock's half-brother Sybok sort of accidentally becomes a televangelist for what he believes is God, but actually turns out to be an enormously powerful and homicidal creature on another planet. It's a long story, but the movie was actually made to point out the weaknesses and problems with televangelists, so that's fair. William Shatner had a big bit of a axe to grind, which don't we all, frankly. People flocking to a preacher does not necessarily speak to their authenticity and authority, being the point. John the Baptist has authenticity and authority, but the fact that flocks of people are coming to him isn't how he proves it. He proves it when, Jesus shows up and actually backs him up.
Mm-hmm. His, head on a silver platter also tends to be a good evidence of prophetic witness.
The fact that he was, genuinely, apparently, a very decent human being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was thinking about that part, too, in verse 5, when people from the whole Judean countryside and all the people of Jerusalem were going out to John, and just imagining, the masses of people. It reminded me of the Doctor Who episode when all of the humans are getting, these earbud things, and they're just, silver things that go on your ears, which is maybe why I hate earbuds. It's not. I hate them because they go in my ears, and it feels weird. But then those actually end up, becoming mind control devices and turning them into Cybermen, and so then they're all, marching synchronized and moving and going wherever their earbuds are telling them to go. So it's this mass of people moving all together. But the people going to John probably not brainwashed,
probably not wearing earbuds.
Also true.
Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the third Sunday of Advent. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NerdsAtChurch, NerdsAtChurch, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on iTunes, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you appreciate what we do or want to get actual transcripts of the podcasts, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/NerdsAtChurch, NerdsAtChurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that. Though if you want to help us out with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christian said,
Pax vobiscum.